guest is Ann Cooper, professor at Columbia Journalism School and former employee of NPR, stationed in Russia in 1987 through 91, that is during Soviet time. And my first question would be, like, can you compare your experience of Soviet propaganda in at the end of Soviet Union and your researches on contemporary Russian propaganda?
Sure. In the mid 1980s, just before Glasnost was beginning, it was still, all media was completely controlled by the state or the Communist Party. There were tons of newspapers and magazines. There was, local and national broadcasting all over the place, but it was, very propagandistic. It was actually pretty dull most of the time, or full of kind of inflammatory rhetoric. That control was obvious. People would rely on things like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe to find out what was really going on in much of the world. That began to change during the period of Glasnost in the 1980s, and then it began to change very rapidly, so that by the time the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991, there was very free media in Russia. It was exciting. It was great media, very independent, very feisty, doing its job as a watchdog, doing investigative reporting. But unfortunately, the economic model, which was state and party subsidies, collapsed, and there wasn't a good economic model to make journalism or to make independent journalism sustainable. So over the course of the 90s, journalism began to lose its esteem with the public, even though it had played an almost heroic role at times, in the final years of the Soviet Union. Journalists became discredited. Some of them took bribes. They helped make themselves very vulnerable when Vladimir Putin took power in 2000. And he began to roll back the freedoms that the media had had, so that now you have very few independent outlets. They don't have much reach. They don't have a large audience. Online may be a little better, but even there we see the Russian government taking control, passing laws to restrict, the space for free and independent reporting. And another thing that has happened, another step that Putin has taken, is to invest a lot of money, like hundreds of millions of dollars, into things like Russia Today and Sputnik, these state-owned media outlets that have a global reach, and they're in different languages, English, French, Spanish, Arabic, etc. And there's many people have denounced RT, the TV channel, which is also on YouTube, as a propaganda arm, a Kremlin propaganda arm. There's something to that, but it's much more complicated. It's not like the Kremlin propaganda arm in the Soviet era, when it was really tightly controlled and very little information was out there. This is much slicker. Technically, it looks good. You've got, very poised journalists, and some of the reporting is good. Some of it is pretty objective, although it's mostly aimed at things like revealing the injustices in American society or in Europe or wherever. And then some of it is just much more propagandistic, especially when the subject is Ukraine or Russia itself. So, some people say, oh, well, things have gone back to the Soviet era. Actually, they haven't. First of all, things are not as tightly controlled as they were in the Soviet era. But secondly, it's the message is much more skillfully presented, and it's being presented to a global audience. All those old Soviet papers were aimed at a Soviet audience. The outside world didn't see them, couldn't read them. Now, what these media outlets produce is available globally, online, on TV, whatever. So it's a much more sophisticated and fascinating operation that some people are very scared of.
So you evaluate that contemporary Russian propaganda is better than Soviet propaganda?
Better. I'm not sure I would choose that word.
More
it's more skillful.
Higher quality.
It's more entertaining. The quality, the production values, and even the journalism is better. They cover the news. They'll cover breaking news stories, whereas, in the old days, the front page of Pravda could be, some big speech that Mikhail Gorbachev had given that really didn't say anything new at all, but it was, plastered all over page one. The news broadcasts on RT look like regular news broadcasts. Some of the stories are not that different from what you would see on, American TV or a European channel. But, the message on certain issues, again, Ukraine, #1 right now, that message is always very clear, and that one is very, rigidly controlled by the Kremlin.
Many people talk today about Cold War era coming back.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that, but you said that the Russian state Kremlin doesn't control media space in Russia that tightly as it used to be in Soviet Union. Do you think it's possible to come back to this controlled, censored media space in Russia?
I think it is a very controlled, censored media space. It's just done in a different way. First of all, you do have a few still independent outlets, Novaya Gazeta, Echo Moskvy, a few others that, are doing the best they can to report news independently. They're under a lot of pressure much of the time, and they don't have a huge audience. But, broadcasting within Russia has very much come back under Kremlin control. If it's not outright owned by the Kremlin, it's owned by, an oligarch who's very sympathetic to the Kremlin. And so that coverage is not going to veer, it's not going to be critical. It's not going to veer away from whatever the Kremlin message is. But again, it's more slickly done, greater production values, addressing often the issues of the day, as opposed to just, the dear leader met with the following 5 delegations that nobody ever heard of today. So it looks better, it's more engaging, but the message can be very, very propagandistic. I think within, we see RT, we see this English language version that I think in some ways is kind of milder than what has happened with broadcast TV within Russia. It can be very, very strident and very propagandistic.
So you think that the instrument of propaganda in Russia is very well tuned, and we know that the government closes some Russian media like Ежедневный журнал, Kasparov.ru and others, while allows Echo Moskvy, Kommersant, RBK, Dozhd to work. And it seems to me that it's the policy is that those media, like Ежедневный журнал or Kasparov.ru, that don't let Kremlin present pro-Kremlin position. They close them, while such media as Echo Moskvy, which gives equal opportunity to pro-Kremlin and anti-Kremlin positions, the Kremlin allows them to work. So the Kremlin, the government establishes that it can be competitive
Right.
inside Russia and outside Russia.
Yeah. Well, this is an amazing, an interesting point, and of course we don't know exactly what the thinking is inside the Kremlin. But people always ask, how is it that Echo Moskvy still exists? They've been around since 1990. The very end of Glasnost. And one theory is, well, Putin wants to keep a few things out there so he can say, what do you mean we don't have independent media here? Listen to Echo Moskvy, they'll beat up on me. And look at Novaya Gazeta. So that, he has a few examples to cite to say to the people who say you don't allow freedom of expression. Is that what his strategy is? I don't know.
That sounds too romantic. Right?
Well, but the other thing is that even those media outlets that are still allowed to operate, they're under great pressure. Dozh has practically fallen apart and disappeared because of pressure from the Kremlin, and the Kremlin's ability to do things like call up their landlord and say, don't renew their lease. And to tell other landlords, don't give space to Dozh TV. That's another means of Kremlin pressure. There's, you can pass laws, you can threaten, or you can just tell people it really wouldn't be advisable for your company to continue advertising with that media outlet anymore. So Putin is very clever at using all kinds of different levers to pressure media. And again, why he doesn't, just completely shut down this handful that are left, I don't know. Maybe that's something for a scholar to study. What is it about this tiny little circle that's left versus, the several that have been closed down most recently? Are they distinctly different? Or, does he really want to just have a few that he can trot out and say, see, there's freedom of expression here. There's critical media here. Yeah, but very few. And they're under pressure, and they don't have a big audience, especially compared to, Channel 1 or the other national TV channels. That's, they have a huge audience, and they're very much under the Kremlin's thumb, presenting the Kremlin line and doing it, with a lot of bombast and stridency right now.
And the last question. We often hear from Russian government this term information war,
Mm-hmm.
that Russia has to win, especially after 2008 Russian-Georgian war. Is the Western thinking the same? Is there real information war, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, this is certainly a notion that's promoted by the Kremlin and by Russian media, by the way, or certainly, the Russian media that is owned or controlled directly, by the state. They certainly have a point when they say, all the coverage of Russia, or most of the coverage of Russia in the West is very negative. Which is why they say they started Russia Today and Sputnik. But I think it's a war that it was kind of invented by the Kremlin, and the Kremlin has its own purposes in promoting the notion that there's a war and promoting the idea to the Russian people that we are at war, and so we have to be strong, and we have to fight the West because they want to destroy us. Sitting here in the West, I don't see that. I do see, some of the arguments that they make. There's some legitimacy. We could certainly do a better job of covering Russia, covering issues, helping people understand, the Crimea crisis, the whole Ukraine-Russia conflict. But an information war, I don't think so. I was in Russia last fall, I was in Voronezh, I was giving a talk, and a guy who said he used to run Lugansk radio TV happened to be there. I don't think it was an accident that he happened to be there. But he claimed, he said, you know, I have worked, he spoke very good English, and he said, I've worked as a fixer for Western journalists, including American journalists, who were covering Eastern Ukraine. And they all tell me, you know, I would lose my job if I wrote the truth about this place. And I said to him, really? What? What did they say they couldn't write? And, you know, it was a classic confrontation. He never answered. You know, he would just sort of veer off onto something else, and I'd try to get back to that, and I never got an answer. And I don't believe that, you know, there were journalists, multiple journalists from the West telling him, I will lose my job if I report the truth about what's happening here. You know, could we do a better job of reporting? Yeah, I mean, I think we should have more reporters spending more time covering that conflict and doing all they can to, you know, try to cover both sides of it. If you can't see both sides, then the coverage obviously, you know, becomes more one-sided. But it's not an information war. It's, I don't believe, at least not from this side.
Well, that's a good news that one side is not at war, only the other side is at war. Thank you very much for coming to our talk show.
Sure, thank you very much.